They put her on the auction block like she was furniture. No bidders, no dignity, just laughter. The whole town of Rio Mesa watched Evelyn Hartwell stand in that courthouse with $340 in debt she couldn't pay and a body they wouldn't stop mocking. The sheriff was about to hand her over to the county workhouse when a stranger in a worn coat stepped forward, dropped every cent of her debt on the table, and said 4 words that changed everything. "I'll take the marriage." Nobody in that room thought it was anything but a bad deal for him. They were wrong about that. They were wrong about a lot of things. Like, comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And stay until the end, because what Evelyn builds from that courthouse floor will shake this entire valley to its roots. The morning they auctioned Evelyn Hartwell, the temperature sat somewhere between miserable and worse, and the courthouse smelled like sawdust, wet wool, and the particular brand of self-satisfaction that comes from watching someone else's life fall apart. She had been waiting since 7 in the morning. Not in a cell. The county didn't bother with cells for debt cases. Not when the workhouse was already full and the paperwork was simpler this way. They let her sit on a wooden bench in the hallway outside courtroom B, her hands folded in her lap, her good dress pressing wrinkles into itself from too many hours of tension. The dress was dark green, the color of old pine needles, and she had sewn it herself 2 winters ago when she still had a reason to own something decent. It was the best thing she had left. Most everything else had already been taken to cover what she owed. The debt was $340 and some cents. She knew the exact number, the way a person knows the weight of something they've been carrying too long. $340, accumulated across 14 months of trying to keep her seamstress shop alive in a town that had decided it didn't need her anymore. Not since the Halverson Dry Goods opened a ready-made clothing section and undercut every independent needleworker in Rio Mesa by 40%. Not since her landlord, a pinched man named Crowell, had raised her shop rent twice in 1 year because he could. Not since the drought had cut into everyone's spending and people started patching their own clothes rather than paying to have them made right. Evelyn was 31 years old. She was not a small woman. She had what her mother had diplomatically called a sturdy frame, and what the people of Rio Mesa called, loudly and without diplomacy, something considerably less kind. She had dark hair she kept pinned back because loose hair caught in needle machinery, and also because it looked more professional, and brown eyes that were sharper than people expected when they looked at her, and hands that were calloused and quick and had been working since she was 12 years old. She was not beautiful in any way that Rio Mesa recognized or rewarded. She had understood this about herself for a long time, the way a person comes to understand the weather, not happily, but practically. The courthouse began filling up around 9. People came in 1s and 2s, then in clusters. Word had gotten around the way word always did in a town of 3,000 where entertainment was scarce and cruelty passed for comedy. Evelyn could hear them through the door, the shuffle of boots, the scrape of chairs, the low murmur of people settling in for something they expected to enjoy. Deputy Marcus Hale came out to get her at 9:30. He was a young man, maybe 25, with a sunburned neck and the decency to look uncomfortable. "Miss Hartwell," he said, and then stopped, like he hadn't figured out what came after that. "I know," she said. She stood up, smoothed her dress, and walked through the door ahead of him. The room held maybe 60 people. Standing along the back wall, sitting in the gallery rows, a few up front near the bar where the attorneys usually worked. Judge Elias Porterfield sat behind the bench like a man presiding over something he'd already decided. He was 60-something, white-haired, with a manner that suggested he'd seen worse but couldn't currently recall what. At the plaintiff's table sat Aldous Crew, attorney for the First Merchant Bank of Rio Mesa, a thin man with expensive boots and the faint smile of someone who charged by the hour. Evelyn walked to the center of the room and stood where they pointed her. She didn't look at the crowd. Not at first. She looked at a point on the far wall, just above the judge's left shoulder, and she kept her face arranged in an expression that she hoped communicated neither fear nor the particular kind of anger that courts interpreted as disrespect. It was a difficult expression to hold. She'd been practicing it since yesterday. "This proceeding," Judge Porterfield began, shuffling papers with the ceremony of a man who enjoyed the sound of shuffling papers, "concerns the matter of debt resolution for one Evelyn May Hartwell, resident of Rio Mesa County, formerly operating as Hartwell Seamstress and Alterations, corner of Callaway and 2nd Street. Total outstanding debt certified by First Merchant Bank at $342.16, incurred across 14 months of unpaid commercial lease and outstanding loan principal. All prior arrangements for settlement having failed, the court proceeds under the Territorial Debt Resolution Act, Section 14, which provides for— "We know what it provides for," someone called from the gallery. There was laughter. Porterfield looked up over his spectacles with the expression of a man who did not like being interrupted, but had also long since stopped being surprised by it. "Order," he said, without particular conviction. Section 14 of the Territorial Debt Resolution Act was not a law anyone had been proud of writing. It had been passed 12 years earlier during a period of financial panic when the territory's banks needed mechanisms for recovering losses and the territory's legislature needed the bank's goodwill. What it provided for, in the clean language of legal text, was compulsory labor assignment or voluntary marital contract as means of debt satisfaction at the court's discretion, where all other recovery mechanisms have been exhausted. What it meant, in the language everyone in that courthouse understood, was an auction. The bidding opened at $50. There was silence. Crew, the bank's attorney, shifted in his seat. He glanced back at the gallery. Nothing. $50, Porterfield repeated with slightly less authority than before. The bidder assumes full debt satisfaction in exchange for a term of domestic labor not to exceed 3 years, or alternatively— "What would I do with that?" someone said from the back row, and the laughter this time was louder. Evelyn felt heat climb up the back of her neck. She kept her eyes on the wall. "She's white as a plow horse," another voice offered, conversationally, as if this were relevant information that the room had been missing. "A plow horse works, at least." More laughter. "Maybe she could sew up those bags under old Crew's eyes. God knows they need it." "Order." Porterfield said it sharply this time. The laughter subsided but didn't disappear entirely. It just got quieter, like a fire tamped down rather than extinguished. Crew leaned over and said something quietly to his associate. His associate wrote something down. The bidding had not moved. 20 seconds passed. 30. Evelyn became aware of the particular silence that occurs when a room full of people is enjoying a spectacle and wants to see how much worse it can get. She had felt it before, in smaller ways throughout her life. The silence before a classroom laughed, the silence before a comment at the general store, the silence before someone at a social function looked at her and then looked away. But she had never felt it quite this concentrated, this deliberate, this openly entertained. She thought about the workhouse. She had seen it once from the outside on the eastern edge of town, a gray building with small windows. The people who came out of it, when they came out at all, came out thinner and quieter than when they'd gone in. She thought, "I have survived everything else. I will survive this too." She was not entirely sure she believed it, but she thought it anyway. $40, Porterfield said, dropping the opening bid, which was itself a kind of humiliation. "The court will accept $40 to— I'll pay the full debt." The voice came from the left side of the gallery, somewhere in the third or fourth row. It was not a loud voice. It was a measured voice, the kind that carried not because of volume, but because of the specific quality of certainty in it, the kind of voice a person develops when they have spent long periods of time alone and learned to say things only once. The room turned. Evelyn turned. The man standing was perhaps 35, though the outdoors and hard work had aged him in the way they aged men who didn't notice they were being aged. He was lean in the way that comes from not always having enough to eat, rather than from deliberate effort, with a jaw that needed shaving and dark eyes set under a brow that suggested chronic squinting against sun and wind. His coat was clean but old, the elbows slightly worn through. His hat was in his hands. He was not a large man, not physically imposing, not the kind of man a room noticed when he walked into it. But he was standing up. "The full debt," he said again. $342.16. I'll pay it today." The silence this time was different, not entertained, surprised. Crew was already on his feet. "And the nature of the arrangement the gentleman is proposing?" The man looked at the floor for a moment, then he looked at Evelyn. She had the impression of being looked at directly, not assessed, not evaluated for usefulness, just looked at. Like a person. "Marriage," he said. "If she's willing." The room erupted. Not in applause. and the kind of noise a crowd makes when it has been given something unexpected and is still working out what to do with it. Part laughter, part disbelief, part the low buzz of people turning to each other to confirm that they all heard the same thing. Judge Porterfield hammered his gavel twice. "Order! This is still a court proceeding." He looked at the man. "Sir, state your name for the record." "Gideon Mercer. I run the Mercer Ranch, South Valley, off the Cobre Road." "And you are prepared to satisfy the full certified debt of $342.16? "I am." Porterfield looked at Evelyn. "Miss Hartwell." He said it with something approaching gentleness, which surprised her. "You understand that under Section 14, the marital arrangement is voluntary on your part. The court cannot compel it. You have the right to decline and accept workhouse assignment instead." Evelyn looked at Gideon Mercer. He was still standing. He was looking at the floor again, hat rotating slowly in his hands, the way a man stands when he is deeply uncomfortable but is committed to something and will not back down from it. She had about 45 seconds to make a decision. She knew nothing about him. She knew the name Mercer. It was the kind of name that belonged to one of the older Valley families, people who had been ranching in this territory for 2 or 3 generations. She thought she might have seen him once, at the feed store, a year ago maybe, but she wasn't certain. She didn't know if he was a drunk, a violent man, a liar, a man with debts of his own, a man who would make her life worse than a workhouse. She had no way of knowing any of these things. She also knew that nobody else in that room had offered her a single dollar. "Yes," she said, "I'm willing." The paperwork took 2 hours. There were forms for debt transfer, forms for the marriage contract, forms for the bank's acknowledgement of full settlement. Crew processed them with professional speed and the slight tightness around his mouth of a man who had expected an easier morning. Gideon Mercer produced cash. Actual bills, counted out carefully on the table, $342.16, from a worn leather envelope that he kept inside his coat. Evelyn watched him count it and understood from the way he counted that this was not money he had a lot of to spare. She signed her name on 11 different documents. Each time she signed, the same thought moved through her head. This is either the worst decision I have ever made, or it is the only decision available to me. And the difference between those two things may not become clear for some time. They were married by Justice of the Peace Harold Finch in a small room off the courthouse hallway. It took 6 minutes. There were no flowers, no music, no guests except Deputy Hale, who stood in the doorway as required witness with the expression of a man trying to appear neutral about something he had a lot of feelings about. "Do you take this man," Finch said, reading from the card he held, "to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Evelyn said. "Do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Gideon looked at her. "I do." "Then by the authority vested in me by the territory," Finch finished the rest of it quickly, the way a man finishes a task he wants to have behind him. "You may... well, congratulations." Nobody kissed. They signed the marriage certificate. Evelyn's hands were steady. She was proud of that. Gideon's wagon was out front, a working wagon, not a pleasure vehicle, with a flat bed and 2 gray horses named, as she would later learn, Amos and Porter. He didn't offer to help her up onto the seat, which she appreciated because she didn't need help and the offering of it would have been its own kind of condescension. She climbed up herself, settled her skirts, and sat while he went around to the other side. They were halfway down Calloway Street before either of them spoke. "I don't know your name," he said. He said it matter-of-factly, like a practical problem that needed solving. "Evelyn?" She paused. "Hartwell. Or Mercer, I suppose." "Now." "Gideon." "I know." Another half-block of silence. The street was busy. Mid-morning traffic, women with baskets, men on horseback, a delivery cart blocking the intersection ahead. Gideon guided the horses around it without apparent thought. "I should tell you what I can offer," he said, "which isn't a great deal. The ranch it's struggling. I won't pretend otherwise. There's a house. It's decent, not large. 2 working hands, Tom Reyes and Bud Callahan. They've been with the property since before my father. There's cattle, about 40 head, which isn't enough to run a profit on the land we've got, but it's what we have. The money I just paid..." He stopped, started again. "That was most of what I'd set aside for winter feed." Evelyn looked at him. "Why did you do it?" He took a while to answer. Not evasively. She had the impression that he was a man who took time with questions because he believed in the accuracy of answers rather than the speed of them. "I know what the workhouse is like," he said finally. "My father knew the man who ran it years ago, before my time. What he told me," he shook his head, "it didn't seem right. What they were doing in there, what they were about to do. You spent your winter feed money on a stranger." "I did. That's not a practical decision." "No," he agreed. "It wasn't." She sat with that. The wagon rolled south out of town toward the valley, and the street noise faded behind them into wind and the muffled percussion of hooves on packed dirt. "I'm a seamstress," she said. "I know accounts. I kept my shop's books for 4 years before everything went wrong, and the only reason it went wrong wasn't the books. It was the rent and the ready-mades, and not enough margin to absorb both. I worked hard. I know how to work. I believe you. I'm not going to be decorative. I don't know how to be, and I'm not interested in learning." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one, quickly managed. "I'm not looking for decorative." "Then we should get along," Evelyn said, "or at least not be in each other's way." They rode in silence for a while after that, and the silence was a different quality than the courthouse silence. Not loaded with anything, just the comfortable absence of words between two people who were both tired and had a long road ahead. The Mercer Ranch sat in the South Valley, maybe 7 miles from Rio Mesa proper, at the base of a long, gradual slope where the grassland thickened and a creek called Seco Run threaded east to west through the property. From the road, it looked like a place that had once been well-maintained and was now conducting a quiet argument with entropy. The fences were standing but needed postwork in several sections. The barn roof had been patched with mismatched timber in at least 3 places. The main house was solid, 2 stories, stone foundation, good bones. But the porch railing had a gap in it, and the front steps had been repaired with boards that didn't quite match. The yard was tidy. That surprised her. She had expected worse. Tom Reyes and Bud Callahan were in the yard when the wagon pulled in, apparently having been given warning of the situation from wherever ranch hands got their information. Possibly just the atmosphere, which had a way of carrying news in open country. Tom was maybe 50. Mexican-born, compact and weathered, with a stillness about him that suggested deep reserves of patience. Bud was younger, mid-20s, red-faced and rangy, with the kind of energy that needed to be pointed at work, or it would find something worse to do. They both looked at Evelyn, not unkindly, cautiously. "Tom, Bud," Gideon said, climbing down. "This is Evelyn, my wife." "Ma'am," Tom said, and touched his hat. Bud said, "How do?" and then immediately looked at his boots. Evelyn climbed down from the wagon. "I'm going to need to understand how the ranch runs," she said. "Not immediately, but soon. Numbers, accounts, what you're spending, and on what. Would either of you have a problem with that?" Tom looked at Gideon. Gideon gave a small, barely perceptible shrug that communicated something between the two men that Evelyn couldn't fully read, but recognized as, "She's serious, and it's fine." "No problem," Tom said. "Good," Evelyn said. "Then let's get started, Bob." The house had 4 rooms downstairs and 2 up. The kitchen was workable, a cast iron range, a good deep sink, shelves that could have been better organized. The main room had a fireplace and a table large enough for a working surface, which she appreciated. There was a small room off the kitchen that had been used for storage, feed catalogs, old harness, 3 broken chairs, and an accumulation of paper that someone had been intending to sort through since at least 1878, based on the dates on the envelopes. Gideon showed her the house without comment, walking through each room with the expression of a man showing something he knew was insufficient but didn't know how to apologize for. "This room," she said, stopping in the storage room. "I can clear this out. I need a workspace, a desk, if there is one." "There's one in the barn. It was my father's." "Can it be moved?" "Yes." "Then this will do." The bedroom situation was awkward in the specific acute way that such situations are when neither person is willing to acknowledge it directly. The house had 1 bedroom on the upper floor. Gideon said, without looking at her, that he would sleep downstairs on the settee in the main room, or the hands had a bunk room in the barn if she preferred privacy. "The settee is fine," she said, "for now. She didn't mean anything by "for now," except that she didn't want to make permanent arrangements on the first day of a new situation. He seemed to understand it that way too, or at least not to misunderstand it. She lay awake that first night in a bed that smelled like cedar and old wool and the faint ghost of whoever had slept in it before, listening to the sound of the valley, wind, insects, the occasional low sound from the cattle in the near pasture. And she thought, I am 31 years old. I am in a stranger's house in a marriage I entered in approximately 45 seconds. I have nothing to my name except the dress I wore this morning and the skills in my hands and whatever I can make of this. She thought, I have been underestimated my entire life. She thought, that's the only advantage I've got and I intend to use it. She slept better than she'd expected. The ranch's accounts were a disaster, not fraudulently. There was no evidence of theft or dishonesty, just of a man who was better with cattle than with numbers, and who had been making decisions based on instinct and habit rather than on anything so inconvenient as documentation. The ledgers for the past 3 years were kept in a battered box under the desk that Gideon had retrieved from the barn and installed, with Tom's help and considerable scraping of door frames, in the cleared-out storage room. The ledgers used 3 different systems across 3 different years, which was itself a problem. One year had gaps of 4 months where apparently no entries had been made at all. Evelyn spent 3 days doing nothing but reading them. She took notes. She built columns. She found the numbers behind the numbers, the pattern of spending that added up over months to something that looked from the outside like bad luck, but from the inside looked like a specific set of correctable errors. On the 4th evening, she came to find Gideon at the kitchen table, where he was eating a late supper, beans, bread, coffee, and she put her notes down in front of him. You're buying winter feed from Kramer's in town, she said. He looked up. Yes. Kramer's is charging you $11 a hundredweight. Halverson's feed supply out on the Cobre Road charges $8.50. That's a 23% difference. You're buying roughly 400 hundredweight a winter. He was quiet for a moment. Kramer's is closer. Not $11 closer. That's $540 over the course of a winter, extra, for no reason except habit. He looked at the notes. Then he looked at her. What else? She sat down across from him and they worked through it. The unnecessary waste of materials, the equipment repairs that had been deferred until they became emergencies and cost 3 times what they would have cost handled early. The cattle that were being grazed on the most water-expensive pasture when the lower pasture, slightly farther from the barn, but fed by the creek, was sitting unused because no one had thought about it carefully. None of it was dramatic. None of it was the fault of laziness, exactly. It was the slow accumulation of a man doing his best with the knowledge he had, in circumstances that required more than best intentions. This is fixable, she said. It's not going to be fast, but it's fixable. Gideon had been looking at the papers for a long time. He looked up. My father ran this place for 30 years. My grandfather built the house. I know, she said it carefully. This isn't about blame. I know it isn't. He picked up one of her notes, read it, set it down. He died 3 years ago, my father. I thought I knew how to do this. Turns out there was more he handled that I didn't know about. The kitchen was quiet. The fire in the range ticked as it settled. You don't have to do this alone, Evelyn said. And then, because she wasn't naturally given to sentimentality and didn't want to make more of the moment than it held, she added, I've got nothing else to do with my time. Might as well make myself useful. Gideon almost smiled. He didn't quite get there, but he almost did. All right, he said. Then let's fix it. The cooperative started not as a plan, but as a conversation. She met Ruth Becker at the Halverson supply store 6 weeks after arriving at the ranch, while she was there arranging the first of the new feed deliveries. Ruth was the wife of Felix Becker, who ran the second largest cattle operation in the valley, roughly double the size of the Mercer Ranch. And she was the sort of woman who said what she thought and had apparently been saying it for decades without particular concern about how it landed. You're the Mercer woman, Ruth said, not unkindly, looking Evelyn over from across the feed display. The one at the courthouse. Yes. Ruth picked up a sack of grain with the ease of someone who had been lifting heavy things her entire life. You know what I think about that whole business? I don't, Evelyn said. I think the bank had the whole valley by the throat and was looking for something to make an example of. Your shop was just the thing they found. Ruth set the grain down. Felix was late on a payment 2 years ago during the drought. You know what they sent? A lawyer. Not a notice. A lawyer, standing in the kitchen. She shook her head. They like to remind you who's got the power. Evelyn studied her. Your pasture borders the Mercer land on the north side. It does. Your creek water comes from Seco Run. Ruth tilted her head. It does. So does ours. So do 3 other properties along the South Valley. Evelyn put her notes on the counter between them. Not the ranch notes, different notes, ones she'd been working on for 2 weeks. After a conversation with Tom Reyes about the valley's water patterns, had sent her down a line of thinking she couldn't stop following. I've been looking at what we're all paying for cattle transport. Each ranch contracts separately with the freight line out of Mesa Junction. Small loads, high per head rates. If we coordinated a single shipment, Ruth was already leaning over the notes. You've done the math. I always do the math. Ruth straightened up, looked at Evelyn with an expression that had shifted from cautious assessment to something closer to interest. Felix is going to say it won't work because it's never been done before. That's not a reason. I know it isn't. Ruth picked up the notes. Can I take these home? I made a copy. Ruth looked at her for another moment, then put the notes in her basket with the grain samples. Come for supper Sunday. Bring your husband if he's tolerable. Evelyn almost smiled. He's tolerable. The first cooperative meeting took place 6 weeks later in the Becker barn, which was large enough for 12 people and a working dinner, and smelled permanently of hay and the animals that had been wintered there for the past 30 years. 12 people came, 5 ranchers, 4 wives, 2 adult sons of neighboring properties, and old Heinrich Strand, who ran the northernmost property in the valley and was 81 years old and attended primarily, by his own admission, to make sure nothing was decided that would annoy him. Evelyn had spent 3 days preparing. Not preparing a speech. She had no interest in making speeches and wasn't sure she'd be good at them. She'd prepared numbers, actual numbers, from actual records, showing what each of the valley's ranches was currently paying for freight, feed, equipment repair, veterinary supply. And next to each number, a second number, what the same service would cost if they purchased together, transported together, negotiated together. The differences were not small. The meeting ran 3 hours and got loud at several points. Felix Becker wanted to know who would be in charge of the money. Old Henrik Strand wanted to know who would be in charge of decisions. A rancher named Prentice wanted to know if this was some kind of syndicate, which he had strong opinions about, and whether those opinions were legally relevant. Evelyn answered every question as plainly and directly as she knew how, which was very. She had no patience for vagueness when numbers were involved, and she had enough experience with financial arrangements to know that the contracts, structures, and decision-making rules mattered more than the goodwill, because goodwill ran out when money got tight. I'm not asking anyone to trust me, she said, when Prentice made a comment about newcomers proposing arrangements. I'm asking everyone to look at the numbers on that page and tell me where I'm wrong. If you find something wrong, say it. If the numbers are right, then the decision is simple. Nobody found anything wrong. The Valley Growers and Ranchers Cooperative was formed on a Sunday evening in October, with 11 signatures on a founding agreement that Evelyn had written out longhand the night before. Henrik Strand signed last, in handwriting that was small and careful and old. "Took 40 years, he said, setting down the pen. Nobody ever organized this before. Nobody had a reason to before, Evelyn said. Henrik looked at her with the expression of a man who has outlived most of his opinions. No, he said. I suppose they didn't. Dem. The first cooperative freight shipment went out in November and saved the combined membership $312 over what they would have paid separately. Ruth Becker reported this to Evelyn at Sunday services with the expression of someone who had bet on a horse they hadn't entirely believed in and was now watching it pull ahead. Felix says it was obvious, Ruth said. Tell Felix it wasn't obvious enough for 40 years. Ruth laughed. A big, unguarded laugh that made the people around them turn to look. I already told him that. By December, 3 more ranches had applied to join. The shared feed negotiations had driven the per hundredweight price down by 18% across all members. Tom Reyes, who had worked the Mercer property since before Evelyn arrived and had seen every kind of winter, told her over coffee one morning that this was the first December in 4 years he hadn't spent worrying about whether the feed supply would hold. "That's something," Evelyn said. "That's a lot," Tom said, and the way he said it was not simple politeness. Gideon, who was not a man who commented on things unless he had thought about them carefully, said one evening while they were reviewing the month's accounts, "The ranch is going to make money this year, actual money, not just break even." "I know. I'm not sure I know what to do with that." She looked at him, tired from the day, the lines in his face honest in the lamplight. Not a comfortable person exactly, but a genuine one. "Put it back into the property first, the fence posts, the barn roof section, over the east stall. And then? And then we see what the next problem is," she said. "There's always a next problem." He almost smiled again. She noticed she'd been cataloging his almost smiles, which was probably not important information, but was the kind of thing you noticed when you shared a house with someone and paid attention. "Evelyn," he said. "Yes?" "I know I haven't—" He stopped, restarted. "I know this isn't what either of us would have chosen, the way it happened. I'm sorry for that." She thought about the courthouse, the laughter, the silence of no bids, the 45 seconds. "I'm not," she said, carefully, not dramatically. "I'm not sorry for where I am." He looked at her for a moment, then back at the accounts. Something had shifted slightly in the room, the way a temperature shifts in the evening. Not dramatic, just noticeably different from what it had been before. "Good," he said. "That's good." Outside, the valley settled into winter darkness, and the cooperative's ledger showed, for the first time, a number that pointed the right direction. Not a large number, not a comfortable number, but a real one, earned honestly, by people who had decided that surviving separately wasn't as good as building something together. It was the beginning. Evelyn Hartwell, Evelyn Mercer, didn't know yet what was coming. She didn't know about the railroad. She didn't know about the water rights document, or the dead man's signature, or the men who would be sent to stop her. She didn't know how hard it was going to get, or how close they would come to losing everything the valley had built. But she knew how to read a ledger. She knew how to find what was wrong and name it plainly and refuse to look away. She knew how to work. That, as it turned out, was exactly enough to start. The cooperative's second freight shipment went out in February, and this time it saved $407. Felix Becker, who had spent the first meeting asking who would be in charge of the money, and had spent every meeting since that asking questions with an edge of skepticism in them, showed up at the Mercer Ranch on a Wednesday morning in late February with a smoked ham under one arm and the expression of a man who has lost an argument he had been conducting entirely inside his own head. "That's for the house," he said, handing Evelyn the ham at the front door. "Ruth says it's a thank you. I say it's practical. People who make us money should eat well enough to keep working." "That's very generous, however it's framed," Evelyn said. "I also want to talk about the spring cattle numbers." She stepped aside and let him in. Felix Becker was a large man in every sense, physically broad, loud in opinion, the kind of man who took up the space he was given and then looked around for more. He and Gideon had known each other for years in the way that neighboring ranchers knew each other, well enough to nod on the road, not well enough to admit difficulty. The cooperative had changed that, slowly, in the way that shared money and shared problems always changed things between people who had previously maintained a careful distance. They sat at the kitchen table, Evelyn, Felix, and Gideon, who had come in from the near pasture when he saw Becker's horse in the yard, and Felix spread out his own set of numbers, rougher than Evelyn's but directionally correct, and they talked for 2 hours about the spring drive, about whether to consolidate the herds for transport, about what a combined negotiation with the Mesa Junction freight line might look like if they brought the full cooperative weight to the table. It was a good meeting, a practical meeting, the kind of meeting where people are working on a problem rather than protecting territory. Afterward, standing in the yard while Felix hitched his horse, Gideon said quietly to Evelyn, "A year ago I'd have told you Felix Becker would never sit at my table and share his numbers." "A year ago you hadn't given him a reason to," she said. He considered that. Fair. The ham lasted a week and was excellent. Bantoit. March came wet and cold, which was good for the grassland and hard on everything else. The Seco Run ran high through the South Valley properties, and Evelyn spent several days watching the creek's behavior, where it spread, where it cut, how the water moved across the different parcels. She had grown up in a river town before her family moved, and she retained the habit of watching water the way other people watched weather, with a suspicion that it was planning something. It was Tom Reyes who first mentioned the notice. He brought it to the kitchen on a Tuesday morning in the third week of March, holding it with two fingers like it was something he'd found in an unexpected place and wasn't sure what to do with. It was a single sheet of paper on the official letterhead of the Mesa Territorial Land and Water Commission, addressed to Gideon Mercer. Evelyn read it twice before she said anything. "When did this arrive?" "Yesterday afternoon. I forgot. It came with the feed delivery and I put it with the invoices." Tom looked at her face. "Is it bad?" She put the paper on the table. "Get Gideon." The notice stated in the clean, bureaucratic language that made bad news sound like routine administration that the Continental Western Railroad Syndicate had filed a formal claim with the Land and Water Commission asserting ownership of primary water rights to the Seco Run watershed, based on a contract allegedly executed in 1871 between the original Railroad Land Grant Office and one Daniel Mercer, Gideon's father, in exchange for survey rights through the South Valley properties. The claim, if validated, would give the railroad control over the allocation of Seco Run water to all downstream properties, with the railroad authorized to charge commercial rates for usage, restrict flow during periods of operational need, and in extreme cases, redirect the watershed entirely for rail infrastructure requirements. There were 14 ranches in the South Valley that drew water from the Seco Run. Every one of them would be affected. Gideon read the notice standing at the kitchen table. He read it the way a man reads something he is hoping will say something different if he reads it again. It didn't. "My father," he said. "They're saying my father signed this. In 1871, that's what it says. He never—" Gideon set the paper down. His voice had gone flat, in the way voices go flat when a person is managing a large amount of feeling by compressing it. "He would have told me. He would have had a record of it. I've been through his papers, everything in that box." "I know," Evelyn said. "I've been through that box too." There was nothing in those papers about water rights. There was nothing about the railroad, nothing about a contract from 1871, nothing about any arrangement with the Continental Western. She had cataloged every document in that box over the course of 2 days when she'd first arrived, looking for the ranch's legal foundations, because that's what you did when you were trying to understand a property's financial position. She would have found it. "This is a land grab," she said. "That's a serious thing to say." "I know what it is." She picked up the paper again, reading the specific language around the alleged contract. "Look at this. Contract allegedly executed." That's their own word. Allegedly. They don't even have a clean claim. They have a document they're presenting as a contract, and they're hoping the commission accepts it before anyone looks too closely. Gideon was quiet for a moment. "What do we do?" "We find out everything we can about that contract before anyone else in the valley sees this notice and panics." She folded the paper. "Who's the commission contact?" "There's a name here. Harlan Briggs. He's in Mesa Junction. I've dealt with him once, years ago, over a boundary survey." Gideon's jaw was set. "He's not a man who does favors." "I'm not asking for a favor. I'm asking for a public record." "Oh." She wrote to the Land and Water Commission that evening. Not a long letter. She had learned that long letters gave bureaucrats more places to avoid answering. Short, specific, citing the exact statutes under which public records requests were required to be honored. Asking for a certified copy of the alleged 1871 contract and all associated documentation. She wrote a second letter to a land attorney in the territorial capital named Silas Whitmore, whose name she had found in a 3-year-old copy of the territorial bar directory that Ruth Becker had, inexplicably, kept in her sewing room. The letter asked whether Whitmore took cases on contingency, because the Valley Cooperative did not currently have attorney's fees in the budget. Then she went to every cooperative member she could reach over the next 4 days. The reaction was what she had expected, and also worse than she had expected, in the specific way that bad news is always worse in the telling than in the anticipating. Felix Becker went quiet in a way that was more frightening than his usual loudness. Henrik Strand, who had seen more than any of them, said only, "The railroad. Of course it's the railroad. Prentice, who had been the most skeptical member at the founding meeting, got loud immediately and in a direction that wasn't useful. He wanted to know if they could physically block the commission survey teams, which was the kind of thinking that led to men in jail and land still lost. "We don't fight it with our bodies," Evelyn told him in the Becker barn, which had become the unofficial meeting place for bad news. "We fight it with records. What if they have the records and we don't? Then we find out what's in their records and we find what's wrong with it. And if nothing's wrong with it?" She looked at Prentice directly. He was a man of about 45, broad-shouldered and sunburned, with the kind of expression that came from spending a lot of time squinting into distance. "Then we deal with that when we find out. But I've been looking at legal contracts for 4 years, and I know what a fabricated document smells like, and this one smells wrong. The year, the language, the timing. It doesn't fit what I know about this valley's history. Someone made this up, or they changed what existed. I intend to prove it." The room was quiet. "How long?" Felix asked. "I don't know. The commission has to respond to the records request within 30 days by statute. The attorney I contacted may or may not take the case. If he doesn't, I find another one." She paused. "What I need from all of you is that nobody sells, nobody makes individual arrangements with the railroad's land agents, and nobody talks to the commission's representatives without consulting me first." "You're asking a lot of trust," Prentice said. "Not hostile. Honest." "I know I am." She didn't dress it up. "You trusted the freight numbers, and they were right. You trusted the feed negotiation, and it saved you money. This is different. This is bigger and harder, and I can't promise it comes out right. But I can promise that the alternative is doing nothing and losing the water." Nobody in that room wanted to lose the water. Water was the valley. Without the Seco run, the South Valley properties were grazing land in a drought cycle, which meant they were worth very little and getting worth less every dry year. The meeting ended with 11 people agreeing to hold, and one, old Henrik Strand, who owned the northernmost property and was served by a different tributary, saying only that he was too old to fight railroads but that he wished them luck, which under the circumstances was a form of support. The commission's response arrived in the first week of April. It was not the certified copy she had requested. It was a letter from Harlan Briggs, Land and Water Commission Director for the Mesa Territorial District, informing her, or rather, informing the legal representative of the Mercer property, which was the polite way of ignoring that she had signed the original letter, that the requested documents were currently under review as part of an active claims proceeding and were not available for public access during that period, pursuant to Commission Regulation 7, subsection C. She had anticipated this. She wrote back the same day, citing the specific statutory override that required public access to historical land records regardless of active proceedings, and requested a formal written explanation of why Regulation 7C applied to a pre-1880 historical contract that predated the current claims process by decades. Gideon, reading over her shoulder as she wrote, said, "You've done this before." "Not exactly this, but bureaucracies all work the same way. They delay until you stop asking. You have to make asking easier than delaying. And if they keep delaying, then we use the delay as evidence of something worth hiding." He was quiet for a moment. "How do you know all this?" She didn't look up from the writing. "I ran a business in a town that wanted me to fail. You learn to read the systems that are supposed to protect you and figure out which ones actually do." She sent the second letter the next morning. Silas Whitmore wrote back in the second week of April. He was brief. Attorneys with actual practices were always brief in their first letters. She had found, because brevity was how they communicated, that their time cost money. He said that he had handled 2 water rights cases in the past decade, that he did not typically take contingency arrangements, but that the specific nature of this case, a railroad syndicate asserting post facto rights through a contract of disputed origin, was, and she could read between those lines easily enough, the kind of case that built a reputation. He would come to Rio Mesa. He would review the available documentation. He would make no commitments until he had seen what they had. He arrived on a Thursday, by stage from Mesa Junction, and he was not what she had pictured. She had pictured someone older, more comfortable, the kind of attorney who worked in a large office and drank good whiskey. Whitmore was 40, lean, with the slightly distracted expression of a man whose mind was usually somewhere other than his face, and he carried 2 large leather bags of documents that he had apparently brought along for reference because he did not entirely trust his own memory on procedural matters. They met in the Mercer kitchen because the Mercer kitchen was where Evelyn worked, and she saw no reason to change her location for an attorney any more than for anyone else. She had everything laid out: the commission notice, her correspondence record, the cooperative's founding agreement, Tom Reyes's written account of the property history under Daniel Mercer, and a hand-drawn map of the Seco Run watershed showing all 14 downstream properties. Whitmore sat down, looked at all of it, and said nothing for a long time. "The alleged contract," he said finally. "You don't have a copy." "The commission hasn't provided one, based on Regulation 7C and 2 subsequent delays." "You've been corresponding directly with Briggs?" "Yes." He looked at her with the particular expression of an attorney who has just recalibrated who he's dealing with. "And your husband's father, Daniel Mercer, there's no record among his personal papers of any such contract?" "None. I've reviewed everything in the estate records personally." Whitmore tapped a finger on the table. "If the contract is genuine, it's possible Daniel Mercer signed it and never disclosed it, or that the disclosure was verbal and not documented. That happens more than people like to admit." "I considered that," Evelyn said. "It's why I checked the date." Whitmore looked up. The date. The alleged contract is dated March 1871. Gideon's father built the first permanent structure on the Mercer property in June 1871. He didn't establish formal residence and water use until that summer. Any contract granting survey rights over the property would typically require the property owner to have established legal domicile, which Daniel Mercer had not done in March 1871. He was still operating out of a temporary camp on the north slope. She opened her notes to the relevant page. "I found this in the county property establishment records. I sent for them 2 weeks ago." The kitchen was quiet. Gideon, who was sitting at the far end of the table and had been largely silent throughout, said, "He was still up on the north slope in March of 71. I remember him talking about that year. The main house wasn't started until summer." Whitmore looked at the property establishment record. He looked at it for a long time. "If this is accurate," he said slowly, "then the contract was signed by someone who was not legally a South Valley property owner at the time of signing, which would make the water rights claim foundationally invalid. Or," Evelyn said, "the contract was backdated." Whitmore set the document down. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile, but contained one somewhere inside it. "Mrs. Mercer, I think I would like to take this case." "On contingency?" "On contingency." He picked up the property record again. "I'm going to need copies of everything you have, and I'm going to need you to write down, in order, every interaction you've had with the commission, every date, every document number. Can you do that?" "I already did," she said, and produced 11 pages of organized notes from the stack at her left. Whitmore stared at the 11 pages. Then he looked at Gideon. "Where did you find her?" Gideon said without expression, "Courthouse auction." Whitmore looked back at Evelyn, clearly not sure if that was a joke, decided it probably wasn't, and said, "Right. Well, let's talk about the commission timeline." Word got out, as word always did. She didn't know where the leak was. Possibly the commission itself. Possibly one of the cooperative members who had told a neighbor in confidence, which was to say, had told them. What she knew was that by the last week of April, there were 2 men she didn't recognize at the general store who asked the owner casually about the South Valley Cooperative and who its main organizers were. The owner, Ned Ferris, told her about it the next day with the expression of a man who had answered questions he was now regretting answering. "What did you tell them?" "Just that it was the Valley Ranchers. I mentioned Becker and Gideon." He paused. "I might have mentioned you." "It's all right," she said, which was not entirely true. It was going to be public eventually. What she didn't tell Ned was that 2 evenings before, she had found boot tracks outside the window of her workspace, the room off the kitchen where she kept all the records, the correspondence, the notes. The tracks had gone around the side of the house and away toward the creek, and whoever had made them had not come close enough to get in, but had come close enough to look. She told Gideon. He went quiet in the particular way he went quiet when something made him angry and he was deciding what to do about it. "We should tell Whitmore," she said. "I'm going to talk to Tom first." Tom Reyes, when told, did not appear surprised. The railroad sends people ahead, he said, before the lawyers, before the commission, people who find out what there is to find out about who they're dealing with. What do they do with what they find? Tom looked at her steadily. Depends on what they find. She didn't sleep well for several nights after that. Not from fear exactly, or not only from fear, but from the particular alertness that comes when a situation shifts from administrative to something with bodies in it. The water rights dispute had been, until the boot tracks, a problem of paper and procedure. Paper and procedure she could manage. The possibility of something more physical was a different calculation. She found herself, 2 nights after the boot tracks, sitting at the kitchen table at 3 a.m. with a lamp and a cup of cold coffee, going through the documentation again. Not because she expected to find something new, but because sitting with what she knew was better than lying awake with what she didn't. Gideon appeared in the kitchen doorway at 3:30, in his boots and coat, the way a man appears when he has also not been sleeping and has given up pretending about it. "Can't sleep," he said. "No." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He looked at the papers spread across the table. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said. She looked at him. In 4 months of shared house and shared table and shared work, she had not often been asked that question in quite that way. Not as a request for information, but as a genuine opening. "I'm thinking about the date on that contract," she said. "I'm thinking about who knew enough about your father to know he wouldn't be alive to dispute it. I'm thinking that this kind of document doesn't get fabricated on short notice. Someone planned this years ago, or adapted something that already existed. And I'm thinking that whoever they are, they didn't expect the cooperative. They expected 14 separate ranchers they could pressure one at a time. Instead, they got us organized. She paused. Which makes it more dangerous, not less, because now they need to move faster." Gideon was quiet for a moment. Outside, the creek ran in the dark, carrying water that someone wanted to own. "I should tell you something," he said. She waited. "When I stood up in that courthouse, I didn't have a plan. I want you to know that. I wasn't thinking about the ranch or the debt or what I needed. He stopped. "I'd been watching it for 20 minutes, and it was wrong. What they were doing, and I didn't know how to stop it except by stopping it." Evelyn looked at him across the lamp and the papers and the cold coffee. There was lampblack on her fingers from sorting documents. She hadn't slept properly in 3 days. Her hair had escaped its pins sometime around midnight, and she hadn't bothered to fix it. "That was the right call," she said. "Even with all this coming?" "Especially with all this coming." She started stacking the papers back into order. "Because if you hadn't stood up, I'd be in the workhouse, and the railroad would be doing this to 14 separate ranchers with no one to connect the dots." He looked at her for a long moment, not with the careful, managed expression he usually wore, something less guarded than that. "Get some sleep," he said finally. "We've got Whitmore coming Thursday." "I will." She didn't move yet. "Gideon?" "Yeah, I'm going to find what's wrong with that contract. I don't know yet what it is or how long it takes, but I'm going to find it." He nodded. Not the nod of a man offering encouragement, the nod of a man who has been watching someone work for 4 months and has formed an actual opinion about what they're capable of. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm not panicking." He went back to the main room. She sat another 10 minutes in the kitchen, then put the lamp out and went upstairs. The valley outside the window was dark and quiet, the creek running somewhere below in the night, and somewhere, in a box of records she hadn't yet found access to, the answer she was looking for. She intended to find it. Whitmore came back on Thursday as promised, and this time he brought a younger man with him, a clerk named Ellis, who carried a second set of document bags and had the permanent expression of someone who had recently learned that legal work was mostly reading and was still adjusting to that information. They spread everything across the Mercer kitchen table and the 2 extra boards Gideon had laid across sawhorses to extend it, and by mid-morning the room looked like a paper flood had come through and decided to stay. The commission had finally responded to Evelyn's second letter, not with the contract itself, not yet, but with a procedural acknowledgement that the historical records request was being processed, which Whitmore said, in the tone of a man translating from a language he found distasteful, meant they were deciding how much they had to hand over and how much they could legitimately bury. "They'll give us something," he said, sorting through the commission correspondence. "They have to. The statute's clear enough that refusing outright becomes its own legal problem. What they'll give us is the minimum, probably a single page, heavily summarized, without the original signatures. Then we need the original, Evelyn said. Yes, which means a formal discovery request once we're in front of a judge, which means we need standing to be in front of a judge, which means we file a counterclaim first. Whitmore looked at her. You've been reading. I borrowed 3 volumes of territorial property law from the Rio Mesa Lending Library. The librarian thought I was researching a family history project. She paused. I didn't correct her. Whitmore almost smiled. Almost. A counterclaim for fraudulent misrepresentation of historical records tied to the property establishment date discrepancy filed before the commission rules on the primary claim. It forces them into court rather than administrative review, where we have more rights. Considerably more rights. He looked at Gideon. This will cost money we haven't discussed yet. Gideon said, How much? Whitmore told him. The number was not small. It was in fact approximately what the ranch had saved its first year of cooperative membership, which was either very convenient or very ironic depending on how a person looked at it. Gideon looked at Evelyn. She said nothing because she had already run the number twice in her head and arrived at the same conclusion both times. They didn't have a choice, so the cost was irrelevant in the way that necessary things are irrelevant to argue about. Do it, Gideon said. The counterclaim was filed on the 14th of May with the Territorial District Court in Mesa Junction. Whitmore handled the filing himself, traveling up by stage with Ellis and returning 2 days later with copies and the slightly hollow expression of a man who is committed to a fight and is now fully aware of its size. The Continental Western Railroad Syndicate's response arrived 11 days later by courier. A thick envelope with a Mesa Junction return address and the railroad's logo embossed on the seal, a pair of iron rails forming a V that was meant to suggest progress, and suggested, to Evelyn, a pair of jaws. The railroad had retained 3 attorneys. Their names were listed on the response cover page: Hargrove, Dent, and Lyle of the Mesa Junction firm of Hargrove and Associates, which Whitmore recognized immediately and described with professional brevity as expensive, well-connected, and not above procedural dirty tricks. 3 attorneys against 1, Felix Becker said, when Evelyn relayed this at the next cooperative meeting. 1 attorney and 1 person who reads property law for recreation, Evelyn said. It's close enough. It got less funny the following week when Prentice came to the Mercer Ranch on a Tuesday morning, hat in his hands, with the expression of a man delivering bad news he had rehearsed the delivery of and was still not comfortable giving. Someone came to see me, he said, standing in the yard because Evelyn had seen his face before he reached the door and had come out to meet him. 2 days ago, at the ranch. The men from the general store? Different men. These were suited, not frontier men. These were the kind of men who come from somewhere with good roads. He turned his hat in his hands. They said the railroad wanted to offer individual settlements, direct, not through the commission, not through the court. Cash, they said. Enough to pay off my property note and have left over. Evelyn was quiet. They said the cooperative wasn't going to win the case, Prentice continued. They said the commission was going to rule for the railroad before the court case even got started. And they said that the people who held out were going to end up with nothing, and the people who settled early were going to be taken care of. And you came to tell me. I said I needed to think about it. He finally stopped turning the hat. I've got a family, Mrs. Mercer. 2 boys, one of them not well. I'm not a brave man. I want to be clear about that. Coming here to tell me this is brave enough, she said. What are you going to do? He looked at her for a long moment. The morning was cool, the creek audible from the yard, the mountains behind the valleys still holding their winter white at the peaks. I don't know, he said honestly. That's why I came. She told him the same thing she'd been telling herself for the 3 nights since the boot tracks. They're offering you money because the contract is weak. People with strong legal positions don't offer settlements before the discovery process. They wait until they've won and let you come to them. Prentice thought about that. You're sure? I'm sure enough to stake my home on it, she paused, which I already am. He left without committing either way. She watched him ride out and stood in the yard for a moment thinking about the 2 boys, one of them not well, and the particular kind of courage it took to tell your family that you were holding out on principle against people with more money and more lawyers, and how principle didn't always feel like enough when you were the one carrying it. She went back inside and wrote a letter to Whitmore about the settlement approach and what it meant for the timeline. What happened in June accelerated everything. Bud Callahan, coming back from Rio Mesa on a Friday evening with the week's supply run, found a section of the north fence cut, not fallen, not damaged by weather, but cut clean with wire cutters, the posts pulled and laid flat, in a way that allowed access to the Mercer property from the road without being visible from the house. He came straight to Gideon, who came straight to Evelyn, and the three of them walked the fence line in the last of the evening light and found 3 additional cut sections along the creek boundary. Nothing was taken. No cattle were disturbed. The message was not about theft. Tom Reyes looked at the cuts and said nothing for a long while. Then he said, "I've seen this before. In the valley to the south, 6 years back, when the timber interests were pushing the smaller landholders out. You cut the fence first. Let them worry about what comes next." "What came next?" Evelyn asked. Tom looked at her steadily. The timber interests got what they wanted. Gideon had the fence repaired by the next morning and rode the boundary himself every evening for a week afterward. He said nothing about it to Evelyn beyond the practical. The fence is fixed, the stock are secure. But she noticed that he started sleeping lighter, waking at sounds she wouldn't have registered, and she noticed this because she was doing the same thing. It was during this week that she found what she had been looking for, not where she had been looking, not in the commission records or the property establishment documents or the cooperative's research. She found it because of Henrik Strand. The old man had driven his wagon down from the north property on a Wednesday morning, which was unusual enough that she came out to meet him in the yard. He was 81 years old and didn't make unnecessary trips. "I've been thinking," he said from the wagon seat, not getting down, "about 1871. She waited. "I came to this valley in 1869. I knew Daniel Mercer. Not well, but I knew him. He was a fair man, careful. He didn't make arrangements, he didn't document." Henrik reached into his coat and produced an envelope, old and soft with handling. "I have letters from those years. Most of them aren't useful. But this one," he held it out. She took it. The envelope was addressed to Henrik Strand in a handwriting she didn't recognize, postmarked from Mesa Junction, dated September 1871. "Read the third paragraph," Henrik said. She opened the letter. It was from a man named Cordell, apparently a land agent Henrik had corresponded with during his early years in the valley, giving advice on property establishment. The third paragraph read, "I have confirmed with the county recorder that the South Valley parcels are all in order. The last of the Mercer improvements were registered in August, completing their establishment process, which began in June, as you know. The railroad survey team came through in October as expected and found no claim conflicts, all parties having been properly consulted at the time of survey." October 1871. The railroad survey team came through in October. The alleged contract was dated March 1871. A railroad survey team conducting the very survey that the alleged contract was supposed to have authorized, and that survey happened in October, 7 months after the contract date, which meant either the survey was badly delayed for no documented reason, or the contract was written to predate the survey retroactively, or, and this was the part that made her hands go still on the paper, the survey had never required a contract with Daniel Mercer at all, because the survey rights had been obtained through the standard territorial grant process, and the 1871 contract had been fabricated entirely, years later, to create a water rights claim that had never existed. "Henrik," she said, "can I keep this letter?" "I brought it for that purpose." He gathered his reins. "I'm too old to fight railroads, but I'm not too old to remember what I know." He turned the wagon and drove back up the road without another word, and Evelyn stood in the yard holding an envelope from 1871 that had just changed the shape of everything. She sent Whitmore a telegraph that afternoon, the first telegraph she'd sent since the case began, because telegraphs cost money and could be read by station operators. This one was worth the cost. Survey timing documented. Stop October 71, not March 71. Stop need original contract signatures immediately. Whitmore's return telegraph came the next morning. Understood. Stop filing emergency discovery motion today. Stop. Come to Mesa Junction. She and Gideon left the following Monday. Tom Reyes stayed with the ranch. Ruth Becker agreed to check in daily and to keep an eye on the cooperative members, who were increasingly nervous as the summer wore on and the railroad settlement offers continued, arriving now by letter directly to individual ranches, bypassing the cooperative entirely, each one slightly more generous than the last. The stage to Mesa Junction took 5 hours and was not comfortable. The territory's roads in summer were either dusty or muddy, depending on the week. And this week they were dusty, which meant they arrived with grit in their teeth and their good clothes showing the journey. Mesa Junction was 3 times the size of Rio Mesa, with the specific energy of a town that existed because of the railroad rather than in spite of it. The Continental Western's regional offices occupied a building on the main street that was larger and better maintained than the courthouse. Evelyn noted this without surprise. Whitmore met them at the stage office. He looked like a man who had not slept well in some time and had decided to work through it rather than address it. The discovery motion was granted this morning, he said, without preliminary. Conditional. They have to produce the original contract document within 14 days. Not copies, not summaries. The original with original signatures for independent examination. They'll resist, Evelyn said. They're already resisting. Hargrove filed a competing motion this afternoon arguing that the original document is held in a secure archive for preservation purposes and that producing it creates unacceptable deterioration risk. He looked at her. Which is the kind of argument that sounds reasonable until you point out that documents held in archives are produced for court examination regularly and that the deterioration argument has never once succeeded in this district. So we wait. We wait 14 days, and then we have the original contract in front of a document examiner. They were in Mesa Junction for 3 days. On the second day, coming back from Whitmore's office in the early evening, they were followed, not subtly. 2 men on horseback, keeping a half-block distance, not bothering to look away when she turned to look at them. She told Gideon quietly, without changing her pace, and she felt him register it beside her. The slight shift in how he was carrying himself, the way his hands moved. "Don't run," she said. "I know. Don't do anything that looks like a problem. I know that too." They walked the remaining 2 blocks to the hotel at a normal pace. The men on horses stopped at the corner and didn't follow further. Inside the hotel lobby, Gideon let out a long, controlled breath. "This is getting serious," he said. It was already serious. She kept her voice even, but her heart was still running fast, and she was honest enough with herself to admit it. "They're trying to see if we'll back down." "Will we?" She thought about Prentice, with his sick boy and his hat in his hands. She thought about Henrik Strand driving his wagon down from the North property with a 40-year-old letter. She thought about Tom Reyes saying the timber interests got what they wanted with the flat expression of a man who had watched it happen and couldn't stop it. "No," she said. On the 3rd day, Whitmore received the document examiner's initial assessment of the commission's summary records, the partial information they'd been forced to provide before the full discovery order. The examiner, a woman named Dr. Clara Fenn, who worked for the Territorial University and had the specific confidence of someone whose expertise was rarely questioned, had found something. They sat in Whitmore's office, the 4 of them, Whitmore, Ellis, Evelyn, Gideon, while Dr. Fenn explained, in the careful language of someone who dealt in proof rather than in impression, what she had observed. "The summary document provided by the Commission references the original contract by its registry number," she said. "Standard practice. But the registry number format, the system for how numbers were assigned in territorial land records, changed in 1874. The number assigned to this alleged 1871 contract uses the post-1874 format." The office was very quiet. "Which means," Evelyn said, "that the contract was registered after 1874. At minimum." Dr. Fenn set down her notes. "If the contract was executed in March 1871 as claimed, it would have been registered under the pre-1874 numbering system. The fact that it carries a post-1874 registry number means it was either registered late, which would itself require explanation, or it was created after 1874 and backdated." "Can you say that in court?" Whitmore asked. "I can say it with confidence, yes." She paused. "I'll need the original to say it definitively, but based on what I've seen," she looked at Evelyn, "someone created this document after 1874 and assigned it a false date of 1871, Combined with the property establishment discrepancy you've already documented and the survey timing from your correspondence letter, it falls apart, Evelyn said. The primary claim falls apart, yes. Dr. Fenn closed her folder with the neat finality of someone who had delivered this kind of news before. The question is what the railroad does when it realizes you know. Whitmore said quietly, "That's what concerns me." It concerned Evelyn too. All the way back on the stage the next day, watching the territory scroll past the window in summer heat, she turned the question around in her head. A railroad syndicate with 3 attorneys and a fabricated document and men who followed people down streets in broad daylight. What did such an organization do when its position was exposed? It fought harder. It moved faster. It used whatever it had left. She looked at Gideon beside her, reading the notes she'd made. His brow furrowed in the way it furrowed when he was concentrating hard on something he hadn't had to concentrate on before. He had not complained, she realized. Not once across the whole of this. Not when the notice came. Not when the fence was cut. Not when the men followed them in Mesa Junction. He had asked questions. He had made decisions. He had shown up. He looked up from the notes and found her looking at him. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Just thinking." He went back to the notes. She went back to the window. The valley was still an hour out. In 10 days, the original contract would be in Dr. Fenn's hands. In however many weeks or months after that, they would stand in a courtroom and lay out every piece of what they'd found. The date discrepancy, the registry number, the survey timing, Henrik Strand's letter, all of it assembled into an argument that the Continental Western Railroad Syndicate had fabricated a water rights claim built on a dead man's forged signature. She didn't know how the courtroom would receive it. She didn't know if 11 ranchers would hold or if the settlement offers would eventually break someone. She didn't know how hard the railroad would push before the court date or what form that pushing would take. What she knew was this. She had started with one courthouse, one public humiliation, one stranger standing up. She had worked her way from that starting point to a document examiner's report and a discovery order in territorial court. She had done it with her hands and her notes and 14 months of reading legal texts that weren't written for people like her. The stage hit a rut in the road and lurched hard. She grabbed the window frame. Gideon grabbed the seat back. For a moment, they were both just passengers in a badly sprung vehicle on a rough road, tired and gritty, and a long way from done. "You all right?" he asked. "Fine," she said. She let go of the window frame. "I'm fine." Outside, the territory stretched west in the afternoon light, hard and wide, and not particularly concerned with either of them. But the valley was ahead, and the ranch was in it, and the cooperative was in it, and 14 families were waiting to find out what 2 people coming back from Mesa Junction had managed to find. Enough, she thought. They had found enough. The original contract arrived at Whitmore's office on the 12th day, 2 days before the court deadline, which told Evelyn something. A party confident in its document produces it immediately and dares the opposition to find fault. A party that waits until the last possible hour is buying time, which means they know what the examination will find and are deciding what to do about it. She was at the ranch when Whitmore's telegraph came. She read it, folded it, put it in her coat pocket, and went to find Gideon, who was repairing the east fence line with Bud in the afternoon heat. "Whitmore has the contract," she said. "Dr. Fenn examines it Monday." Gideon straightened up from the fence post, wiping his hands on a cloth. He read her face before he read the telegraph. "And?" "They waited until the last hour." He was quiet a moment. "That tells us something." "Yes." Bud was pretending very hard to be busy with the wire stretcher, which was his way of communicating that he understood the conversation didn't include him while also communicating that he very much wanted to know what was happening. Evelyn had grown accustomed to Bud's particular style of hovering, which was somehow both obvious and well-intentioned. "Bud," she said. "Ma'am, if someone asks you anything about the case, the ranch, the cooperative, or any of our business, anything at all, what do you say?" Bud considered this with the seriousness of a man who had been given this instruction before and was taking it more seriously each time. "I say I just work here and don't know nothing about nothing." "Good. Can I ask how it's going, though? Just to me." She almost smiled. "It's going. That's all I can say right now." Bud nodded, satisfied with this in a way that suggested he had not expected more and was genuinely grateful for what he got. Dr. Fenn's examination report came back on Wednesday, 6 days before the court date that Whitmore had secured for the preliminary hearing. Evelyn read it at the kitchen table with Gideon beside her and Whitmore present in person, having come down from Mesa Junction specifically to go through it together. The report was 22 pages. The conclusion was on page 20. The original contract document presented by the Continental Western Railroad Syndicate bore physical characteristics inconsistent with a production date of March 1871. Specifically, the paper stock used was a commercial grade not available in the territorial supply market prior to 1876. The iron gall ink showed oxidation patterns consistent with a document aged 15 to 20 years, not 50. And the signature attributed to Daniel Mercer, when compared against 3 authenticated Mercer signatures from the county property records and 2 private letters provided by the Mercer estate, showed significant inconsistencies in pen pressure, letter spacing, and the specific formation of the capital M that Daniel Mercer used consistently across all authenticated samples. It was not Daniel Mercer's signature. It had been signed by someone attempting to replicate Daniel Mercer's signature. The attempt was reasonably skilled and would likely have passed casual examination. It had not passed Dr. Clara Fenn. Whitmore set the report down. He looked at the table surface for a moment. Then he looked up. "That's our case," he said. "That's everything." Gideon had been reading while Whitmore spoke. His jaw was tight. He set the report down carefully, the way a man sets something down when he is trying not to put it through the table. "Someone forged my father's name," he said. "Yes." "Someone sat down, practiced his handwriting, and signed his name on a document to steal this valley's water." "That's what the evidence shows," Whitmore said. He paused. "I know that's not just a legal statement for you." "No," Gideon said. "It isn't." Evelyn put her hand on his arm. Not a dramatic gesture. She didn't have the instinct for dramatic gestures, just a brief, direct pressure. He looked at her. She looked back. "We use it," she said. "All of it. In front of the court." He breathed once, nodded. "Monday," Whitmore said, gathering the report. "We present this at the preliminary hearing and request full dismissal of the water rights claim. With Dr. Fenn's testimony and the documentary evidence, the registry number discrepancy, the survey timing, the property establishment dates, the railroad's claim doesn't have a foundation left to stand on." He paused. "There's one thing." "What?" "Hargrove is going to argue that the document irregularities are the result of archival handling, not fabrication. He'll produce an archivist who will testify that post-period paper contamination happens in storage. It's the only move they have left, and they'll make it credibly." "Can Dr. Fenn counter it?" "She can. The ink oxidation argument is the strongest. Archival contamination doesn't affect ink chemistry that way. But I want you to understand that Monday isn't going to be clean. It's going to be loud and contested, and it's going to feel for part of it like we're losing." Evelyn said, "I felt like I was losing before. I can manage it." Whitmore looked at her with the expression he had developed over the past months, which was somewhere between professional respect and the slightly bewildered admiration of a man who had not expected to find what he found when he took this case. "I know you can," he said. What happened the Friday before the Monday hearing was not something any of them had planned for. Prentice came. Not to the ranch this time. He rode directly into Rio Mesa and found Evelyn at the general store, where she was picking up supplies, and he came in through the door with the expression of a man who had not slept and had made a decision and was not sure yet whether it was the right one. "I signed it," he said. She stopped moving. "The settlement. They came back Thursday, more money, and they said—" He stopped, started again. He was a big man physically, and he looked somehow smaller than his body. "They said there was evidence that the cooperative was engaged in anti-railroad activity that could expose the members to liability. They used legal words I didn't understand. My wife was there, my boy, the one who's been sick. He had a bad week. Ned Ferris, behind the counter, found something extremely interesting to look at on the shelf behind him." Evelyn looked at Prentice for a long moment. She thought about the easy thing to say, which was what he'd done wrong and how it affected the case. She thought about the harder thing, which was what it meant to be a man with a sick child and a threat he didn't have the education to fully understand, and people with better suits and more money telling him the outcome was already decided. "How much did they pay you?" she asked. $4,000. He said it quietly, like the amount shamed him even as he recognized it was real money. I've never had $4,000. Is it in writing that it covers only your individual settlement and doesn't affect the cooperative claim? He blinked. I didn't check. Show me the document. He produced it from his coat. She read it in the store, standing between the flour sacks and the lamp oil. 3 pages of railroad legal language written to be confusing but containing, if you knew where to look, the specific boundaries of what had been settled. She went through it twice. This doesn't break the cooperative case, she said finally. Your individual water allocation is settled separately. It doesn't withdraw the cooperative standing. Some of the terrible tension in his face eased slightly. They may try to use it as leverage, she continued, to show the court that members are accepting settlement, which implies the claim has validity. Whitmore needs to know before Monday. I know. He was looking at his boots. I know I should have. You did what you had to do for your family, she said. It came out more plainly than she'd intended, which was probably correct. I'm not going to tell you that was wrong. I would have done the same thing in your position. She folded the settlement document and handed it back. Come to the hearing Monday. Sit with the other cooperative members. Let them see you didn't disappear. He looked up. They'll know I settled. Some of them already know. They're not going to throw you out for protecting your children. She paused. Come anyway. He left. Ned Ferris waited until the door closed and then said carefully, Does this hurt you? Some, she admitted, not fatally. She picked up her supply list and went back to it, because she had a hearing in 3 days and a ranch to keep running, and worrying about Prentice's decision wasn't going to change it. But the night before the hearing, she couldn't settle. She had prepared everything that could be prepared. The documentation was organized, copied, annotated. She had gone through Dr. Fenn's report until she could recite the key findings from memory. She had written out, at Whitmore's request, a clear narrative timeline, every date, every document, every discrepancy, in the order they would be presented, that Whitmore could reference without looking lost. She had done all of it, and it was as good as she knew how to make it. And still she sat up late, not reviewing papers this time, but just sitting at the kitchen table that had become the center of everything, in the house she had arrived at 8 months ago, not knowing the man who owned it or whether she'd made the worst decision of her life in the 45 seconds she'd had to make it. She heard Gideon on the stairs. She had gotten better at recognizing the particular sound of him moving through the house, the way he walked quiet but not careful, the specific creak of the third stair that he always forgot. He came into the kitchen and took his usual chair across the table without asking if she wanted company, which was something she had come to appreciate about him. He didn't ask permission for things that were already clear. Tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow. He looked at the empty table surface. I keep thinking about my father, about whoever sat down and copied his handwriting. He was quiet for a moment. He was a careful man. He would have hated this. Not just the theft, the pretense of him agreeing to it, like he was complicit in his own loss. He wasn't. I know, but he can't say so. He looked up. That's part of what tomorrow is, making the record correct. Evelyn thought about that. The idea of a record, of what got written down and what got remembered and what got revised by people with enough money and patience to do the revising. She had spent 8 months fighting over a record. A piece of paper, dates and numbers and signatures. The whole valley's future threaded through the question of whether one document was what it claimed to be. Gideon, she said. Yeah, when this is over, and it will be over, one way or another, what do you want? For the ranch? For the valley? He thought about it for long enough that she knew he was taking the question seriously rather than answering quickly to fill the space. I want the place to run, he said. To actually run, not just survive. I want Tom to know he has a job for as long as he wants it. I want the cooperative to keep going because it's the right way for the valley to work, not just because we needed it in a crisis. He paused. What do you want? She hadn't been asked that in a long time. Not by anyone. I want to keep working, she said. I want to build something, not just the ranch, the cooperative, the valley. I want to be part of something that lasts. She looked at her hands on the table surface, calloused and ink-stained, the hands of someone who had worked most of her life and didn't know any other way to be. I didn't have that before. In Rio Mesa, in the shop, I was just surviving, waiting for the next thing to go wrong. And now? Now I'm building. She said it simply. That's different. He looked at her across the table. The lamp between them was burning low, and neither of them reached to adjust it. Something had shifted in the room, the way things shifted between people who had been living alongside each other long enough that the careful distances start to feel less necessary. I'm glad you stayed, he said. I didn't have anywhere else to go, she said. I know. But you stayed anyway. And you... He stopped. Tried again. You made this place worth keeping. She didn't know what to do with that, not exactly, so she did the honest thing and sat with it rather than deflecting or reducing it. Get some sleep, she said finally. Tomorrow is going to be long. Yeah. He didn't move immediately. Evelyn? Gideon. For what it's worth, whatever happens tomorrow, I'd do it again. Standing up in that courthouse. Even if I'd known all of this was coming. She looked at him. The lamplight was low, and the kitchen was quiet, and 8 months of shared work and shared trouble were sitting in the room with them. So would I, she said. The 45 seconds. He almost smiled. All the way this time. Not quite. Not fully, but closer than usual. Then he went back upstairs, and she sat another 10 minutes before following, and outside the valley was dark and still, the creek running steady over its stones, indifferent to courts and railroads and everything that small human beings built their lives around trying to protect. The hearing was in the Rio Mesa courthouse, the same room. She walked in on Monday morning and registered this. The same bench gallery, the same bar, the same high windows that let in the particular quality of morning light she remembered from the last time she'd stood in this room as the subject of proceedings rather than a participant in them. She noted it, filed it, and found her seat beside Whitmore at the respondents' table. The gallery was full, more full than she'd expected. Not just cooperative members, though most of them were there, Prentice included, sitting in the second row with the careful posture of a man trying to take up less space than usual. There were townspeople too, and ranchers from the North Valley who weren't cooperative members but had interest in the outcome, and 2 men in the back row she didn't recognize who were writing in small notebooks and were almost certainly newspaper correspondents. At the other table sat Hargrove, Dent, and Lyle. 3 attorneys in good suits, with thick files and the collective confidence of men accustomed to winning in rooms like this. Hargrove was the eldest, silver-haired, with the expression of someone who found the opposing counsel's table only mildly interesting. Judge was Arthur Vane, mid-50s, with a reputation Whitmore had described as fair, impatient with delay, and not particularly sympathetic to either railroads or ranchers by default, which was as neutral as you could reasonably hope for in this territory. Vane called the room to order with a single gavel strike and got to it. Hargrove opened for the railroad. He was good, genuinely good, the kind of good that came from doing this for 30 years. He framed the water rights claim as straightforward, the documentation as legitimate, the counterclaim as a bad faith delay tactic by a rural cooperative that stood to lose a legal dispute and was manufacturing procedural obstacles to avoid the outcome. He referenced the contract. He referenced Daniel Mercer's purported signature. He mentioned, with careful casualness, that one cooperative member had already accepted settlement, suggesting, without quite saying, that even the ranchers themselves understood the claim had merit. It was well done. Evelyn sat through it and kept her face where she needed it and wrote 3 notes on her pad for Whitmore. Then Whitmore stood up, and he was thorough and organized and clear, which was his particular strength. He walked through the timeline, the date, the property establishment record, the survey timing letter, the registry number format. He presented each piece as a separate fact, cleanly, without drama, which was the right approach because the facts themselves were dramatic enough. Then Dr. Fenn testified. She was precise and confident and immune to Hargrove's cross-examination in the particular way that experts are immune when their expertise is genuine. The archival contamination argument was exactly what Whitmore had predicted, and Dr. Fenn dismantled it with the paper stock evidence. No archival contamination changes the manufacturing composition of the stock itself, and the ink chemistry, and finally, in language that the gallery could follow without legal training, the signature. The letter spacing in the alleged signature shows a 3 mm consistent gap between the capital M and the lowercase e, she said. In all 7 authenticated Daniel Mercer signatures and evidence, that gap is between 1 and 1.5 millimeters. It is a small difference, but it is consistent across every authenticated sample and absent from the disputed document. Signatures are habits. People don't vary their own habits by 3 millimeters consistently across decades. She paused. Someone else wrote this signature. The gallery had been getting progressively less quiet through Dr. Fenn's testimony. By the time she finished, it was not quiet at all, and Judge Vane struck his gavel twice. Hargrove's recross was vigorous and eventually ineffective. He asked about measurement methodology, about examiner bias, about the chain of custody of the authenticated samples. Dr. Fenn answered every question with the same unhurried precision she'd brought to the direct examination. She didn't become defensive. She didn't reach for more than the evidence supported. She just kept answering. When it was over, Vane called a 15-minute recess. Evelyn sat at the table during the recess and did not turn around to read the gallery's faces, because she had learned long ago that reading a room when you were waiting on something important made the waiting worse. Whitmore went through his notes. Ellis refilled the water glasses. Gideon, who was in the gallery rather than at the table, sat with his hands on his knees and his eyes forward. The 3 railroad attorneys conferred in the far corner of the room, close together and quiet. And Evelyn watched, without appearing to watch, the body language of men recalculating. When Vane came back, he didn't take long. The court finds that the documentary evidence presented by the respondents raises substantial and credible questions regarding the authenticity and provenance of the contract document on which the primary water rights claim is based, he said, reading from his notes in the level tone of a man delivering a finding rather than a verdict. The court therefore orders the primary water rights claim of Continental Western Railroad Syndicate against the Seco Run watershed properties suspended pending full investigation, and refers the matter of potential document fraud to the Territorial Attorney General's office for independent review. He looked up from his notes. The injunction against the cooperative's water usage is lifted effective immediately. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down. The room came up. It was not the kind of noise a room makes at a conclusion. It was the kind of noise a room makes when a held breath is released by 60 people at once. Felix Becker said something loud enough to earn a look from the departing judge. Ruth grabbed Evelyn's arm from the gallery railing with both hands. Prentice was on his feet without appearing to have decided to stand. Whitmore turned to Evelyn and said, with the understatement of a man who had been practicing law for 20 years and understood the value of not overstating victories, "That's a very good result." "It's not over," she said. "No, it isn't. The Attorney General investigation. The railroad will fight that too." "They will. But they'll be fighting it from a position where their primary document has been publicly questioned by a court and where we have the full discovery record." He paused. "It's a different fight from here. A better one." She looked around the room. At Ruth still holding her arm. At Felix trying to pump Gideon's hand with the energy of a man who had been holding tension in his body for months and was now attempting to expel it all at once. At Prentice standing at the back with the careful expression of a man who had settled and was watching the outcome of not settling and was doing complicated arithmetic about it. "What happens to the railroad's people?" she asked. "Hargrove, the men who actually fabricated the document." "The Attorney General investigation will go looking," Whitmore said. "Whether it finds the right people depends on how well those people covered their tracks and how much pressure the federal level decides to apply." He picked up his files. "That part isn't in our hands." She understood that. She didn't entirely like it, but she understood it. Gideon found her on the courthouse steps 10 minutes later, after the room had mostly emptied into the street, and the noise had moved outside to become the general noise of a town processing surprising information. He looked like a man who had been underwater for a while and had just surfaced, blinking in the brightness. "The water's ours," he said. "Just that." "For now," she said. "There's still the investigation, the federal piece. The Attorney General may or may not move quickly. I know." He wasn't dismissing the caution, just setting it aside for a moment. "But today it's ours." She looked at the street. Rio Mesa, which had auctioned her in this building 8 months ago, was going about its afternoon with the cheerful indifference of a town that didn't particularly track what it had done wrong. The courthouse behind her was the same courthouse. The bench she'd sat on was the same bench. What was different was everything else. Yes, she said. Today it is. She was already thinking about the investors, though she didn't say so yet. The men Whitmore had mentioned in passing. The Eastern money that had been watching the valley's mineral surveys with interest. The next shape of the pressure that always found its way to places worth protecting. She was already thinking about what came after a battle won, which was not rest, but a different kind of work. But that was tomorrow. Today, the water was theirs, the cooperative was intact, and the valley was still the valley. And one woman who had once stood in this building with nothing stood outside it now, with considerably more, built out of nothing except what she refused to let go of. That was enough for one day. The Attorney General's investigation moved the way territorial government moved, slowly, with long silences between visible actions, and then all at once. For 3 months after the hearing, nothing seemed to happen. The railroad's water rights claim sat suspended. The cooperative's water flowed undisturbed. The Seco Run ran through the South Valley the way it always had, indifferent to the legal argument that had been conducted over its future. Life on the Mercer Ranch returned to something that resembled normal, which was itself a new kind of normal, one where the accounts were organized, the fences were maintained, Tom Reyes didn't spend December worrying about feed, and Evelyn had graduated from the storage room workspace to a proper desk in the corner of the main room that Gideon had built over a long weekend in September without being asked. She noticed when he moved it in. She didn't make a production of it. She said, "The angle is good for the light," and he said, "That's why I put it there." And that was the whole conversation, but it was the kind of conversation that meant more than its surface. The cooperative held its autumn meeting in the Becker barn as usual, with 14 members now. 3 more had joined since the hearing, word having traveled that the Valley had a functioning mutual organization with actual financial results. Felix Becker had appointed himself unofficial treasurer, which no one had agreed to but everyone had stopped disagreeing with, possibly because Felix's arithmetic was reliable even if his personality required management. Prentice came to the autumn meeting. He sat in his usual spot and said less than usual, which was already not much, and at the end of the meeting he helped stack the chairs without being asked. Nobody addressed the settlement directly. It existed in the room the way uncomfortable things exist in rooms of people who have decided to continue working together. Present, acknowledged by its absence from conversation, gradually becoming part of the past rather than the present. It was Ruth Becker who said something privately to Evelyn, walking out to their wagons after the meeting. "He's been carrying it," Ruth said, "about Prentice. His wife told me." "I know. He thinks he let everyone down." "He protected his family," Evelyn said. "The case held without him. It was supposed to be able to hold without any one person." She paused. "That was the point of building it the way we did." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "You planned for someone to break." "I planned for the possibility. People break under pressure. That's not a character flaw. It's just what people do when the pressure is real enough and the stakes are personal enough." She stopped at the wagon. The cooperative can't survive if it requires everyone to be brave all the time. It has to be structured so that one person's fear doesn't sink the whole thing. Ruth looked at her with the expression she had developed over the past year. Not exactly admiring, more like the look of someone who has been consistently surprised by the same person and has started to find the surprise comfortable. "Felix says you think like a lawyer." "Felix should be careful. That's almost a compliment." Ruth laughed her big, unguarded laugh and climbed into her wagon, and Evelyn drove home on the autumn road with the leaves turning on the valley oaks and the mountains going purple in the late afternoon. And she thought about Prentice carrying his shame and about how people were always so much harder on themselves than the situation required, and how that was one of the more exhausting things about being human. The letter from the Territorial Attorney General's office arrived on a Thursday in November, addressed to Whitmore and copied to the cooperative as a registered interested party. Whitmore sent his own letter with it, brief as always, with a note at the bottom. "This is what we were waiting for. Call it a victory, but read the fine print." The Attorney General had completed its preliminary investigation into the Continental Western Railroad Syndicate's water rights claim and associated documentation. It had found sufficient evidence to support a finding of deliberate document fraud, including the fabrication of the 1871 contract and the forgery of Daniel Mercer's signature. The man directly responsible for executing the forgery had been identified, a surveyor turned records clerk named Aldous Veitch, who had worked for the railroad's territorial land office since 1879 and had been, it emerged, performing similar document adjustments for the railroad in 3 other territories over a period of 12 years. Veitch was arrested at his office in Mesa Junction on a Wednesday morning and did not resist, which Whitmore said suggested he had been expecting it for some time. The railroad itself, the syndicate's senior officers, the men in the good offices in the eastern cities who had directed the land strategy, was a more complicated matter. The Attorney General's letter was careful about this, using language that Evelyn read 3 times and translated, as she often did with careful legal language, into plain terms. They knew it went higher than Veitch. They could probably prove it went higher than Veitch. And proving it in court against men with the resources to hire the best attorneys in the country was a different and longer fight that the territorial government was not certain it wanted to take on alone. She sat with that for a day. The incompleteness of it. Veitch in custody, the men who gave Veitch his instructions still in their offices. She had spent enough time with legal reality by now to understand that this was often how it went. The person with the pen got the charge, and the person who ordered the pen kept the distance. It was wrong. It was also frequently true. She wrote to Whitmore, "Is there a federal angle?" He wrote back, "Working on it." There are 2 other territories where similar claims were made. If the pattern holds, federal wire fraud statutes may apply. This is not over, but it is no longer our primary fight. She accepted this, the way she had learned to accept the difference between what was right and what was currently possible, with the specific frustration of someone who intended to keep the gap in mind rather than pretend it didn't exist. The water rights claim was formally dismissed in December. The SECO run stayed with the valley. The investors arrived in the spring. She had been expecting them since October, when a geological survey team had spent 2 weeks in the valley taking core samples on the eastern slope, which anyone could see if they watched the ridgeline in the mornings. The survey team was professional and polite and declined to say who had hired them, which answered the question well enough. In April, 3 men came to Rio Mesa and requested a meeting with the cooperative. They were from a Denver-based investment firm called Carver Capital, and they were not railroad men. They were something newer, something the territory was only beginning to learn the shape of. Resource investors, men who had made money in the silver boom and were now looking for the next extraction opportunity before anyone else found it. The meeting was held in the same Becker barn. Evelyn had asked Whitmore to attend, and he had come down from Mesa Junction without needing to be asked twice, which told her he understood what kind of meeting this was. The lead man from Carver Capital was named Preston Vale. He was 40-something, well-dressed without being showy about it, and he had the particular manner of someone who had learned to present large numbers as routine information because large numbers stopped being impressive to him some years ago. He was not hostile, he was not threatening. He was, in many ways, more dangerous than the railroad men had been precisely because he was genuinely pleasant. "The Eastern Slope Survey indicates substantial copper deposits," he said, with the directness Evelyn had expected. "Potentially significant ones. We're prepared to offer mineral rights leases on the eastern portions of the valley properties at rates that would, for most of these families, represent more money than they've seen in aggregate across their entire ranching operations." He quoted numbers. The barn was very quiet. The numbers were real. That was the first thing Evelyn registered, and she registered it without flinching from it, because flinching from the reality of an offer was how people got outmaneuvered. The numbers were real, and for families who had been fighting financial pressure for years, they were the kind of real that made it hard to think about anything else. She could see it in the room. Felix Becker, who was not easily moved by anything, was doing arithmetic behind his eyes. 2 of the newer cooperative members had the expression of people doing the same. Prentice, in the corner, looked at his hands. Vale continued. The leases would be structured as long-term arrangements, with the mineral extraction occurring over a projected period of 15 to 25 years. The impact on surface operations would be minimal, which was a word Evelyn noted carefully. There would be employment opportunities for Valley residents during the extraction period. The company was reputable, had operated in 3 other territories, and could provide documentation of their environmental practices. When he finished, he looked at the room with the comfortable patience of a man who had made this presentation before and knew how the silence that followed it usually resolved. Evelyn said, "What happens to the water table?" Vale looked at her. He had been told who she was. She could see that in how he'd positioned himself when she entered, the slight recalibration. Our geological team's assessment is that the primary aquifer is located below the extraction zone and would not be significantly impacted. Significantly. The technical assessment indicates minimal risk to Mr. Vale. The valley's water supply runs through a watershed that we spent the better part of a year defending in territorial court. The families in this room make their living on cattle and crops that require reliable water. Minimal risk and not significantly impacted are not the same as no risk and not impacted. She paused. I'd like to see the full geological report, including the sections on aquifer depth and the projected extraction methods and their interaction with subsurface water movement. Vale was quiet for a moment. The pleasantness didn't go away exactly, but it became more careful. That report is proprietary to Carver Capital. Then we can't evaluate the offer without independent geological assessment, which we would commission ourselves before any member of this cooperative considers signing anything. He looked at her. She looked back. Around the barn, 14 people were watching this exchange with the attention of people who had recently learned that what sounded like good news could have different things inside it. That's a reasonable request, Vale said, finally. I'll see what I can arrange in terms of documentation. She said, we'll need the full report, not a summary. He said he'd be in contact with Whitmore, which was his way of ending the conversation without ending it, and he and his colleagues left with the polite efficiency of men who had expected an easier meeting and were recalibrating. After they left, the barn was quiet for a moment. Then Felix said, That's a lot of money. Yes, Evelyn said. You don't want to take it. I want you to understand what you're taking before you decide. She looked around the room. The money is real. I'm not disputing that. What I'm telling you is that we built this cooperative on water. If the extraction compromises the aquifer, even minimally, even in 15 years, we've traded the water for the money. And the money runs out. The water, if we protect it, doesn't. But we don't know yet if it compromises the water, Felix said. Not argumentatively, actually thinking. No, we don't. That's why we get the report first. She paused. I'm not telling anyone what to decide. I'm telling you not to decide before you have the information. It was a different room than the first cooperative meeting. Same barn, same smell of hay and old timber, but different in the way rooms are different when the people in them have been through something together and know what the other faces mean when they're thinking. Nobody moved to sign anything. Nobody walked out in anger at the caution. They sat with it, the way people sit with complicated things when they've learned that sitting with them is better than moving too fast. Old Henrik Strand, who was 82 now and came to fewer meetings but had come to this one, said from the back, I've seen 3 booms in this territory, silver, timber, now this. You know what all 3 left behind? Nobody answered. Holes, he said, and the people who made the money were gone before the holes mattered. The meeting ended without a vote. That was itself a decision, or the beginning of one. The geological report came 6 weeks later, after Whitmore had pushed through a disclosure agreement that Vale had resisted and then accepted. Evelyn read all 214 pages. She hired, with cooperative funds, an independent geologist named Professor Marcus Webb from the Territorial University, not Dr. Fenn's department, but he knew her and trusted her recommendation to review it. Webb's assessment took 3 weeks and came back in plain language, which she had specifically requested. The copper extraction process as designed would, over a 20-year period, lower the primary aquifer depth by an estimated 8 to 12 feet in the eastern portions of the valley. For properties on the western side, the impact would be minimal. For properties drawing from eastern watershed feeds, 4 of the cooperative's 14 members, the impact over time would be substantial enough to require either well deepening or water management infrastructure that would cost, in aggregate, more than the lease payments would generate. She presented this at the next meeting without editorial. She put Webb's numbers beside Vale's numbers and let the room read them. The vote on whether to decline the Carver Capital offer was 9-5, not unanimous. 5 families, all on the western side, where the aquifer impact was genuinely minimal, voted to accept. 4 of them eventually did negotiate individual agreements with Carver Capital for the portions of their eastern slope land where extraction could occur without affecting their water supply. Evelyn had helped structure those individual agreements to ensure they included binding aquifer monitoring requirements and automatic termination clauses if the water table dropped below specified depths. She did this without resentment for the five. People made decisions based on their own circumstances, and their circumstances were real. What mattered was that they made them with accurate information. The cooperative held. Smaller decisions fractured it in smaller ways over the years that followed. Disagreements about transport contracts, a dispute over fence line costs, 2 members who left and 2 new ones who joined. It was never the seamless alliance that its founding agreement looked like on paper. It was messier than that, and more durable for being messy. The way things are more durable when they're built for real conditions rather than ideal ones. The Territorial Attorney General's federal referral bore fruit 2 years after Veitch's arrest. A federal grand jury in the Capitol found sufficient evidence to indict 3 senior officers of the Continental Western Railroad Syndicate on charges of wire fraud, conspiracy, and multi-territorial land theft. The indictments made the territorial newspapers for 2 weeks straight. Whitmore sent a clipping with a note that said only, "There it is." 2 of the 3 eventually faced trial. 1 was convicted, 1 died before the proceedings concluded. The 3rd reached a negotiated settlement that included substantial financial penalties and a permanent bar from operating in the territory. It was not complete justice. It was not the satisfying total accountability that the story deserved in theory. But it was real consequence, public and documented, and it changed what future companies considered when they looked at the South Valley and thought about the cost of trying to take what didn't belong to them. That, Evelyn had learned, was how the world actually changed. Not in single decisive moments, but in accumulated costs that eventually made predation less profitable than it used to be. The ranch thrived. Not dramatically, not overnight, but in the way that ranches thrive when they are managed well over a long period. Steadily, with setbacks absorbed and recovered from, with each year building slightly more margin than the last. They doubled the herd over 4 years. The barn roof was fully replaced. The porch railing was repaired properly this time with matching timber. Tom Reyes took on a young apprentice, a 15-year-old named Diego, his nephew's boy, who arrived from across the territory with a serious face and quickly demonstrated that he had inherited Tom's particular gift for reading cattle and his patience for difficult work. Bud Callahan got married to the Ferris girl, Ned's daughter, Cora, and moved to a small property 2 miles up the road that he and Gideon built the house for over the summer, working on weekends, getting sunburned and arguing about the best way to set a ridgeline beam, and ultimately arriving at a roof that was sound if slightly uneven in one corner. At some point, she couldn't have said exactly when because it happened the way genuine things happen, without announcement. The arrangement between Evelyn and Gideon stopped being an arrangement and became something else. It happened in the accumulated weight of shared mornings and shared work, and the specific intimacy of 2 people who have been in difficult situations together and know exactly what the other person does when the pressure is real. It happened in conversations at the kitchen table that started as practical and ended as something more. It happened in the way he learned when to ask what she was thinking and when to sit with her in silence, and in the way she learned that his almost smiles meant more than other people's full ones. One evening in late autumn, the 2nd year after the hearing, he said, "I want to ask you something." They were on the porch. The valley below was going gold and brown, the light low and long, the mountains at the edge of the sky. "Ask it," she said. "I want this to be a real marriage." He said it plainly, the way he said things when he'd been thinking about them long enough that the careful phrasing had worn away, and what was left was just the true version. Not arrangement, not practical, real, if that's something you want. She looked at him. The man who had spent most of his winter feed money on a stranger, who had counted out $342.16 on a courthouse table without knowing anything about who she was or what she was capable of, who had shown up every day for 2 years for everything the valley had thrown at them. "I've been running a real marriage for some time," she said. "I was just waiting for you to notice." He looked at her. Then he actually smiled, fully, the whole way, without managing it back down. And it changed his face in a way she had not seen before and decided privately that she would like to keep seeing. "Evelyn," he said. "Gideon," she said. The valley spread below them in the autumn light, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and the silence was the kind that doesn't need filling. Chuds. Years passed in the way years pass when life is full, faster than they should. and marked not by single dramatic events, but by the texture of ordinary days that add up slowly to something that can only be seen clearly from a distance. The cooperative became a model. Not a perfect model, there was no such thing, but a working one, the kind that other valleys and other struggling communities looked to when they were trying to figure out how to hold themselves together against pressure that was bigger than any one of them could resist alone. Evelyn was asked to speak, eventually, at a territorial land management conference in the capital. She declined the first invitation and accepted the second, and gave a presentation that was entirely composed of numbers and structural recommendations, and that received, from the room of men who had expected something more inspirational, a silence that gradually became the most attentive quiet she had ever spoken into. Two women came to find her afterward. They had a ranching cooperative in the Northern Territory that was facing a similar water rights challenge. They wanted to know how she had built the documentation case. She told them everything, all of it, in specific detail, because the information was not useful kept to herself, and the women in front of her had the look of people who needed it now. One of them said, at the end, "How did you know it would work?" "I didn't," Evelyn said. "I knew what the alternative was." The porch they sat on, years later, was better than the original. Gideon had rebuilt it the summer after the hearing, properly this time, level and sound, with a railing that didn't have a gap in it. The view it looked over was a valley that had changed in the ways a good valley changes. More settled, more tended, the marks of people who had decided to stay and build rather than extract and leave. Evelyn was 53 years old. Her hair had more gray in it than dark now, and her hands were more calloused than they'd ever been. And the desk in the corner of the main room had 20 years of ink and organization worked into its surface. She was not a famous woman. She was known in the valley and known in certain circles in the territory, and occasionally her name appeared in documents that other people referenced without knowing where the original work had come from. That was fine with her. She had never done the work to be known for it. She had done it because it needed doing. Gideon was beside her, as he had been for 22 years, with the specific weathering of a man who had spent 2 decades working outdoors and not minding it. He was slower than he used to be, a bad knee from a fence repair 3 years back that hadn't healed quite right, and quieter, which she hadn't thought was possible. But the quality of his quiet had changed over the years. It was no longer the managed quiet of a man holding feeling back. It was the settled quiet of a man who had found his place and stopped arguing with it. The valley below them was the same valley it had always been, and also not. The Seco Run still ran east to west through the south properties, still fed the same 14 parcels, still behaved the way water behaves when it hasn't been interfered with, predictably, generously, without condition. Tom Reyes had retired 2 years back to live with his sister, and Diego ran the cattle operation now with 2 young hands of his own. The cooperative was 31 members and had recently negotiated a territory-wide freight arrangement that its founding members would not have thought possible. Prentice's son, the one who had been sick, had recovered, grown up, and was now one of the cooperative's most active voices on the transport committee. Prentice himself had died 4 years ago, a sudden thing, a hard winter. At his funeral, Evelyn had told his wife that he was a man who protected his family. When protecting his family was the hardest thing he could do, and that the valley was better for having had him in it. She meant every word. The night was coming down over the mountains, the light going from gold to copper to the deep blue that preceded dark. Somewhere in the lower pasture, cattle moved. In the kitchen, there was a smell of dinner that Diego's wife, a serious young woman named Maria, who had recently proposed expanding the cooperative's conservation agreement to include watershed buffer zones, an idea that Evelyn had supported immediately, had left on the stove when she'd gone home an hour ago. "You're quiet," Gideon said. "I'm thinking." "About what?" She considered this. The valley below, the years behind it, the courthouse at the beginning of all of it where a room full of people had laughed at a woman with nothing and a man had stood up for reasons he couldn't entirely articulate. "About how you don't know what you're building when you start," she said. "You think you're solving a problem. You're just trying to get through the next thing. You don't see the shape of it until you're far enough away to look back." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "And what shape is it?" She looked at the valley, the creek below, the pasture fence lines, the lights coming on in the distant properties as the dark came in, small and steady, evidence of people who were still here, still building, still water-fed and intact and present. A life, she said. Just a life. But the kind you build with your hands and keep with your hands, and the kind that doesn't belong to anybody else. He put his arm around her, not dramatically, just the easy, settled weight of a man who has been doing this for 22 years and intends to keep doing it. They sat like that while the valley went to dark. There is a thing that happens when people are told from the beginning that they are not worth much, that they are too much of one thing and not enough of another, that the space they take up is a problem, that their best hope is something better than what they deserve. The thing that happens is that some people believe it. And some people, after they have been given enough time and enough hardship and enough reasons to test whether it's true, discover that it was never true at all, and that the people who said it were small and afraid and needed someone smaller to stand beside to feel large. Evelyn Hartwell had not set out to prove anything. She had set out to survive, and then to be useful, and then to build something that lasted. That she had done all three of those things, and in doing them had made a courthouse's laughter into something no one in that room would have recognized. That was not triumph in any clean sense. It was just the long, uneven, imperfect work of a woman who refused to accept the value that other people placed on her life. The creek ran below. The mountains held the last of the light. The valley breathed in the dark, full of people who had water because one woman had known how to read a ledger and had refused to look away from what the numbers said. That was enough. It had always been enough. She just had to be the one to prove it.